here with Thom, a double Oscar winner for The Incredibles and The Right Stuff. Tell us something about yourself, Randy.
Well, I'm a director of sound design at Skywalker Sound, which is in Marin County, a little north of San Francisco. But I'm lucky that I don't have to be an administrator most of the time. I actually work on movies, doing sound for movies. And I've been with Lucasfilm more or less for a little over 30 years now.
You're here as part of the Institute for Screen Industries research project of collaborating between, or fostering collaborations between academia and industry. Can you tell us what your thoughts are about the project and whether you think it's a good idea?
I'm very interested in collaboration, specifically collaboration on specific films between the sound department and the rest of the crafts, including the director, including the screenwriter. And so I have an overall interest in collaboration, especially early collaboration in pre-production. And the fact that ISIR is interested in fostering collaboration between academics and the screen industries is also of interest to me for similar reasons.
As you know, as part of the Institute, we have a group of students who are doing great work, and they're part of this thing called Creative Student Network, which brings together students from all kinds of disciplines. Do you think it's a good idea, first of all, to have students from not just from film and television, but from all walks of life, as it were? And what advice do you have for them, if any?
Well, I think it's a great idea to bring students together from a variety of disciplines in the context of filmmaking and studying filmmaking, because for the same reason that I advise young people to not just jump into the industry, but to get a degree and to study the history of filmmaking, because the broader your perspective, the better stories you're likely to be able to tell. And if you include perspectives from completely outside of film, I think you can only benefit from that.
Now, you've been a very vocal, in a good way, supporter of the notion of sound being much more of an integral part to the filmmaking process, suggesting to the rest of the industry that there may be a different way to think about sound and a different way to think about collaborating, especially in the pre-production phase of a movie. Would you like to say something about that?
Yes, sound and sound design especially tend to be thought of as something that happens in post-production. And so decisions about sound are often deferred until the very last possible minute. What that means is that the screenwriter and the director and the other craftspeople who are working during pre-production, and in fact while a film's being shot, typically don't feel the need to think very thoroughly about how sound is going to be used in a given scene or in a sequence of scenes. They have the attitude that the sound can be fixed later. And unfortunately, that's rarely the case. That's a myth, that sound can be fixed later. Certainly it's a myth if you're interested in doing very deep, rich, interesting things with sound and storytelling. You really have to front load those kinds of ideas very early in the process and allow the sound ideas to influence creative decisions in all the other crafts. So that's been my soapbox for the last several years.
When you look at credits, very many people have the word design next to the title. Costume designers, sound designers, production designers, and cinematographers say that they design with light. But they will all have different understanding of what the term design means. In your personal experience and opinion, what does sound design actually means?
Well, I think that the role of the sound designer is to help the director figure out what the film should sound like. Unfortunately, especially in Hollywood, the term sound designer has come to mean the geek who you hire to make the spaceship sounds. And there's a long history behind that that I can go into some other time. But the grander notion of sound design means somebody who starts working on a project very early in the process, brainstorms with the director, potentially with the screenwriter, about how sound can be used, and then follows through all the way through post-production and certainly during production to experiment and implement sound ideas and foster the kind of collaboration that the other crafts have, or at least tend to have more than sound does. Sound has sort of been the caboose at the end of the train, whereas some of the crafts like production design, for instance, and cinematography traditionally have had more doors open to them in terms of collaborating very early on and exchanging ideas, and sometimes there's friction, as there always is in any kind of collaboration, but when you work hard at it and you're lucky, you get the benefits as well. I've been teaching myself oil painting, landscape painting over the last decade or so. And I think that there are a lot of parallels between painting and sound design. It's about layers and it's about composition and what to focus on. And the big advantage for me with painting is that I don't have somebody looking over my shoulder all the time, suggesting I do something another way. But I think that there are parallels between what I do as a sound designer and almost every other craft. I think all of the arts have those parallels. That is, deciding what to focus on, experimenting and getting good at recognizing a happy accident when it happens, because that's where, let's face it, a lot of the best stuff comes from places you don't expect and happens during the process of doing the art. And I think all the arts share that.
Let's talk for a second about the creative process. When you get a script, you read it. What do you think next? What do you do? Can take us through the creative process?
Well, as I'm reading a script, I am certainly imagining sounds, but I try as best I can to begin every project with as few assumptions as possible. That is, I'm not trying to duplicate what I did on the last dinosaur movie that I worked on, for instance. I'm trying to create something fresh. And so I don't always trust my first inclinations in terms of the sounds that I'm hearing in my head as I'm reading a script. What I look for in a script is not so much specific references to specific sounds. You know, he pulled the gun and fired it, that kind of thing. What I'm looking for is doors that are open to sound by playing with time and with point of view, principally, those two things. And I'll give you an example. I have the first 2 pages of the script for Apocalypse Now. One was the original script written by John Milius, and the other is the revision done by Francis Coppola. The script by John Milius is a perfectly respectable script, very straightforward, and probably would have made a very good war film. But at some point along the line, Coppola decided to tell the story more from the point of view of the soldiers, of the American soldiers in the war. And so he designed shots to be highly POV, to give you the impression that you're seeing and therefore hearing things through the filter of the consciousness of those soldiers. So the first page of the Milius script describes specific sounds in the jungle where the first scene took place. Ironically, the Coppola script, which is a much better script for sound, has no specific references to sounds on the first couple of pages. But the very first sentence is, "You see a line of palm trees as if through a dream." As soon as the sound designer sees that kind of language in a script, we get excited because we know we'll have a lot of latitude to play with the sound because it's point of view. We're not describing an actual physical space necessarily, we're describing what's going on in the mind of the character. And so that's when sound design really becomes very much like music.
Would you therefore say that you approach designing the kind of internal world of a character differently from designing the external world that he or she inhabits?
Yeah, it is very different. And the way shots are set up determine to a great degree what you can do with the sound. The hardest kind of shot to do interesting sound for is a medium shot that's brightly lit, where the camera doesn't move, unless something darn interesting is going on in that shot. It's very difficult to do anything very powerful or emotional with it in terms of sound, typically, not always, but typically, because there's so little subjectivity in it. It's a very objective kind of camera angle. So the kinds of shots that get sound designers excited are always the ones that are highly subjective.
The dark corners.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Many people have commented from both camps, from both the music camp and the sound camp, about the fact that sometimes there are clashes between the music, the score, and the actual soundtrack. Can you tell us where does that originate from? Because there's a lot of different views about this, and whether it is something that can be avoided and how so.
Oh no, never. There's never any conflict. Well, it's when there is conflict, it's the fault of the director between the sound design or the sound effects and the music. And on the films where there's the most conflict between the sound effects and the music, it happens because of an insecure director who thinks that he or she has to throw all of the ammunition, at the same time. They have to shoot every gun and throw every bomb that they have at the same time. And what you wind up with is just a cacophony that's kind of meaningless and incoherent. And so one of the things that I always lobby for is to begin thinking very early on about whether sound effects or music will dominate in a specific moment. And very often I'm the first person in a mix to say, let's get rid of the sound effects or let's lower the sound effects because the music really does what we need here in a way that the sound effects can't. Sometimes I argue the reverse, of course. But it's that kind of deep, thorough thinking about how the sound is going to function in a film that I'm really pushing for more than anything else, rather than the director saying to the sound designer, it's really all on your shoulders in this sequence, and then he goes and tells the composer, it's all on your shoulders for this sequence, and we wind up at the mix with what sounds like Niagara Falls, and then spend the next day or two trying to weed it out and make sense of it, as opposed to actually having it coordinated from the beginning. It has everything to do with this deferring of decisions that I mentioned earlier. The director would like to think, well, we'll just create as many sounds as possible, musical and sound effect sounds, and we'll just work it out later. Somehow we'll figure it out, it'll all make sense. And unfortunately, it rarely does. Sometimes people say sound is 50% of the experience. Odd though that sound is never 50% of the budget. I wonder what kind of black hole in economic theory, allows that to happen. That this quantity that's 50% of the value is somehow only 1% of the cost. I think, in fact, sound is sometimes 50%. And by sound, I mean all the sound. Obviously, the actors speaking is sound, and there's a lot that can be done with dialogue as sound design that hasn't been tried and done. I think that's one of the exciting areas of sound design. But yes, there has been sound design in film for about 100 years. There never was a silent film era. There was an era where there was no audible dialogue, but all mass consumption films have always had at least musical accompaniment of some kind, and very often the orchestra or the pianist or the organist or the person operating the early sound effects generating machines was doing a kind of sound design. So sound design has been with us forever. We haven't called it sound design until a decade or two ago. And the great power of sound is that it's invisible. It sounds double-edged sword. The fact that you can't see the sound, and we do tend to be a visually dominated species, causes us sometimes to minimize the value of sound. But the very fact that we minimize sound and therefore don't realize how it affects us, because we don't bother to analyze how it's affecting us, gives the filmmaker an extraordinary tool, because the filmmaker can get at people's hearts and emotions and minds through the soundtrack in ways that are impossible visually, because he sneaks in the side door to the consciousness. So it's a double-edged sword that we sound people have to live with somehow.
Randy, Thom, thank you very much for coming here to Nottingham to work with us and for your time today.
You're welcome.